Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, we're going to get started. I'm sure we're going to have other people coming in. I think a lot of our friends are used to us doing things at 12:30, so I hope they don't come in and find that we have wrapped up. I'm Elliot Gerson, Executive Vice President of the Institute, and as always, I am particularly thrilled to welcome people to a program sponsored by our Sports and Society program. Um, I was just speaking earlier this morning to some guests here from the Rose Bowl and had an opportunity to reminisce a little bit about how we established this program. Tom, what year was it now? Was it 2011? So I was right. I said it was about 8 years ago. And many people were wondering how an organization that is known so well, not only in this country, but around the world, that focuses on issues of critical issues of foreign policy, domestic policy, poverty, climate change, education, higher education, and on and on. Why would we start a program on sports? Uh, and for me, it was a fairly obvious answer that sports is an essential part of our culture and that of every culture in the world, that it is an incredibly important part of what makes us human, how we interact with other people. It is important to our identity, to national identity. It is one of the few aspects of culture that unifies just about everybody, regardless of their background, their ethnicity, their color, their economic status, and it touches just about everything. I mean, even some of the things I mentioned earlier, like foreign policy. I mean, ping pong helped us open up relations with China. Nelson Mandela was incredibly excited about the power of football or soccer to bring people together in Africa. And so many other issues and not just health and fitness, but morality, leadership, and so much about our sociology and our relations have to do with sport. And of course, it's one of the biggest sectors of the economy. So it was a natural thing to do. The only thing we had to do was who do we find with a broad vision to run it? And that turned out to be surprisingly easy because we met Tom Farrey, whom I'm going to turn things over to in a minute. Not just a very distinguished sports journalist, but a sports journalist with a strong passion about sports and equity and about the importance of play to children and to children of all ages and assuring equal opportunity to play. And he, with a growing team, have built an amazing operation. For those of you who don't know much about the rest of the Institute, I sort of alluded to things. We're a hard place to understand because of the range of things we do. But if there's one thing that brings everything we do sort of together, and so you can understand it, from our leadership programs to our seminars to our policy programs across the landscape of domestic and foreign policy, and also our overseas Aspens, of which there are now in 11 different countries. Essentially, the common DNA to everything we do is that we convene leaders around critical problems and issues and don't just convene them and talk with them, but we try to inspire action, catalyze change to make it a better world. And that very much reflects the vision that Tom and his team have for the sports and society program. So today, on behalf of the Institute, I am delighted to welcome all of you, and particularly our speakers, and especially Sarah Hirshland, who is the CEO since last August of the U.S. Olympic Committee. With that, again, welcome all of you, and I'll turn things over to Tom.
You can have that. Well, thank you, Elliot. I know this is exciting for you as well because you're a huge Olympics fan. Always wants to talk to me about what's coming up in Rio or wherever else it may be.
Just planning on what the plans are going to be in Los Angeles.
Well, I live in Los Angeles, so I know I'm going to be there now. Yeah, no, and just thrilled to have everyone here as well, including the folks on live stream. Welcome to our Future of Sports series, our quarterly conversations where we think through some of the biggest topics at the intersection of sports and society. We launched this series a year ago with the Future of Sports. And we always put like a big question on the table, a big what if question. So in the case of football, it was what if flag became the standard way of playing the game until high school? Got a lot of smart people together from diverse points of view and really thought that through. College sports, what if athletes had the ability to get sponsorships like any other student would on campus? What would be the scenario that would unfold there? Sports betting. What if we did as Colorado has done with the lottery, which is take the money being collected there and directing it into community recreation? Or in the case of Norway, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, taking sports betting and other forms of gambling and also funding their whole sports infrastructure from the top to the bottom. Athlete activism. What if athletes commonly expressed points of view, whatever it may be, in the course of their work? How would our world change if we heard more from athletes and on social issues? So each of these conversations really is an act of looking into the crystal ball, a way of thinking through best as possible what the future might look like if a key challenge or a bold vision unfolded. On some level, it's an act of scenario planning, helping stakeholders chart their courses, hopefully in service of the common good. And that's what we aim to do with the Sports and Society program. Our mission is to convene leaders, facilitate dialogue and inspire solutions that help sports serve the public interest. Each conversation has made news. That's how robust and interesting these dialogues have been. And now we have a media partner, which we're thrilled to say is joining us on this series. That is the Washington Post. So thank you to the Post for being part of our work. Today's topic builds on the headlines that have topped more than a few news cycles in the past few years. In December, the law firm Ropes and Gray released an independent report commissioned by the board of the U.S. Olympic Committee into sexual abuse in Olympic gymnastics. The 252-page report highlights failures by leadership of the USOC and USA Gymnastics to protect scores of athletes from former team doctor Larry Nassar. The report stated, quote, "These institutions and individuals ignored red flags, failed to recognize textbook grooming behaviors, and in some egregious instances, dismissed clear calls for help from girls and young women who were being abused," unquote. Nassar went to prison. The former CEO of the U.S. Olympic Committee and as well as the CEO of USA Gymnastics resigned their posts. Other folks lost their jobs, were fired. Congress dug in, asking how could this possibly happen? So did many media outlets telling the horror stories of survivors. Today's event takes this public conversation where it needs to go next, which is how to actually solve this problem. How do we create systems level change to protect athletes in the future? And we're talking about all athletes, down to the age at which children enter sports, and from all forms of abuse, not just sexual, but emotional and physical abuse, which are even more common than sexual abuse. Most of us know of a kid whose body or spirit was broken by a coach who just pushed him or her too hard. In 1978, Congress tasked the U.S. Olympic Committee with playing the lead role in coordinating amateur sports activity in this country at all levels. But it was an unfunded mandate. In my book, Game On, which I wrote 10 years ago, I reported on the sausage-making process that led to the Amateur Sports Act. An annual subsidy of $30 million was supposed to go to the USOC, but got stripped out at the last minute to get the bill passed in the middle of the night by a handful of representatives who remained in the chamber at that late hour. The bill was also ambiguously worded in places, but there were commies to fight, and we were in the middle of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Team USA had just gotten drubbed, really, in the '76 Olympics. Jimmy Carter signed that law into effect. As time wore on, USOC leaders told Congress, we can't afford to both get athletes off the couch and onto the podium. That we need to focus our limited resources derived largely from sponsors on the tippy top of our sports pyramid, Olympic athletes. Congress did not push back. Over time, priorities and incentives shifted further toward the pursuit of money and medals. The women's gymnastics team delivered both, and here we are. But our model is not the only pathway to the podium. I wrote about this in the New York Times last month. At last year's Winter Olympics, Norway won more medals than any nation in the history of the Olympic Games, 39. The US finished fourth in the medal count. I was blown away. I was helping host a podcast for NBC Sports and got to talk to folks there. You know, Norway is a nation of 5 million people, smaller than Minnesota. And how did they do this? Was it all that snow? Well, no, we have more snow in this country and more people on skis than they do. Was it the government paying their athletes large sums of money? Hardly. Most get close to nothing from what I could tell. Just a little bit of training support. Drugs, were they doping? No real evidence of that either. Talk to the Norwegians as I did on a trip there in March, and they'll tell you that the great strength of their system is what they do at the base with children. Their version of the Olympic Committee has a document ratified by all NGBs and each state called the Children's Rights in Sport, which describes the type of experience that all kids in the country must have access to, as well as what programs cannot do. Violate its principles, and a federation or club could lose access to government grants that help fund facilities as well as programming. I mentioned Norway's model because this is one of the things we do at Aspen. We pump big ideas into the bloodstream and see what takes. We'll explore what we like and what we like and what we don't, and what's possible and what's not, with the speakers in each of these sessions, to get everyone thinking big so we can build a sport ecosystem that doesn't just prevent abuse, but builds lives and communities. Please do share your thoughts as the conversations unfold and afterward. We'll leave 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of each session, and encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Aspen It's Sports, and join the conversation on Twitter at Aspen #AspenSportsLab. With that, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Sarah Hirshland. Sarah joined the USOC as its new CEO last August, as Elliot mentioned, to navigate the organization through the turmoil to a better place. She came from the US Golf Association, where she served as Chief Commercial Officer. Prior to that, she was Senior VP for Strategic Business Development at Wasserman Media Group. She is a graduate of Duke University. Please try not to hold that against her, okay? All right, Sarah, you want to please join us.
We're an obnoxious Duke crowd, so everybody has to caveat that all the time. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you as well. Let me just start off by first just thanking you for being a woman. There are far too women.
Thank my parents for that.
I know, I recognize the ridiculous of the statement. But there's so few women in leadership positions in the world of sports. It's amazing. With Title IX, we're starting to see people move up through the ranks, but someone in your position at the top of a critical organization like the US Olympic Committee is really terrific. And I think it's extremely important for us to pull on the talent from the other 50% of the population. And I'm sure you're going to do great things. So thank you for being who you are. So let's talk a little bit about the experiences that shaped you over time, because I want the crowd to get to know you.
Okay.
Where are you from? What are your values? And how did sport shape who Sarah Hirshland became?
Sure. So interestingly, I was born in a very small mining town in the mountains of Colorado called Silverton, Colorado. I think the population's about 800. Mm-hmm. Ironically, my parents met hitchhiking in Aspen in the late 60s, which will give you a little bit of indication of how my parents thought about the world back then. But we ended up in Colorado. I grew up in Colorado, ultimately went through middle school and high school in the suburbs of Denver. And had the great fortune, my mom was a huge believer in education. worked very hard to get me and to wind me into a private school education on a scholarship. And I think I always, because of that, I always felt a sense of obligation to sort of, thank her for that. But in the course of that, I went to a private school in which sports was a mandatory part of the curriculum. You were obligated as a student to play a sport 2 out of 3 seasons of the year. And so regardless of where you were, you had choices in that, but it was a mandatory part of the curriculum, and it kept us there all day. We were there until 5:30 because after the school curriculum, you went in to play your sport. So here I am, a young person who lived in the suburbs of Denver, going to a private school in a very affluent neighborhood with a community of kids who quite frankly, didn't live the same lifestyle I was living. And sports was the one place where all of that vanished. And so very quickly for me, it became the barrier breaker. It didn't matter that I didn't have a car. It didn't matter that I didn't wear the right kind of blue jeans. It didn't matter what my friends, who I had some really close friends who came from inner city Denver in a similar environment, to me in this private school, because they were there on scholarship. They were, diverse students at the time. And so it was our common ground, if you will. And so sports very early in my life became a common vocabulary where the barriers came down. And as such, I was drawn to it, not because I was an amazing athlete, although I am incredibly proud that we won the state championships in soccer, and I will be proud of that forever. I was not good enough to go on and do the same thing in college, but I loved it. And so I made a determination at that point that it was where I wanted to spend my time, and that meant my professional life. I went to school. I was fortunate enough to get into Duke, and I went to school with all intentions of being a doctor. Graduated with a BS in biology, took the MCAT, was on my way to medical school. But when I was in school at Duke, got a job as an athletic trainer because that seemed like the really logical path to sort of feed me into sports medicine and into being in the sports medicine world and a doctor in that field. A spring football practice. I was staffing a group of athletes with water, and as the trainer, we had an athlete take a not particularly violent but unfortunate hit and was temporarily paralyzed from the neck down. And it was a moment in which all of the sports medicine staff leaned in, and I wanted to run and hide. The emotional aspects of it absolutely tore me apart. And so I had a bit of an epiphany and a challenge of saying, this is a real problem. I'm headed down a pathway that is not for me. And so I very quickly diverted and said, I want to be in sport, but I don't think I can handle spending my life seeing people in pain in their moments of great trouble. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a reasonably emotional person. I wear that on my sleeve from time to time, and so it was a real, and I'm incredibly fortunate that I didn't spend the time going through medical school. Loved the biology, find the human body fascinating, still do, but took a different path and diverted and started working in the sports marketing and promotions office at Duke Athletics. They were really kind to sort of allow me to pivot. The degree was long too far down the path at that point. I fell into an initial job working for a sports technology startup company in the late 90s. That was an MBA on the job. It was an incredible ride. We went from 8 of us in a garage to 450 people, went through $100 million in venture capital funding, and proceeded to turn around and file bankruptcy. And that was an amazing learning experience for me. As a young person who, quite frankly, was in the right place in the right time, we knew as much about websites and technology at that point as people who were 20, 30 years our senior. And so we had credibility way, way beyond our years. And it really did give me opportunities to learn a lot about business, to learn a lot about management of people, to learn a lot about sport and content and storytelling in the industry. And so that sort of fed my career. I then went on to work, as you said, in what was a small group that Wasserman acquired, ultimately in the sports consulting business. Spent a lot of time on the for-profit side, understanding the dynamics of mostly professional sport, and then got a phone call from a headhunter that said the United States Golf Association has a new executive director, and they're looking for someone to come run business affairs. Are you interested? And It was the first opportunity I had to go work for a mission-driven organization, an organization that was there for sport's sake, not for profit. And that was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And I'm incredibly glad that I did. It was really fulfilling. I spent 7 years at the USGA really helping with some transformational work in and around golf. Golf is I play the sport. I love it. I'm also not a particularly talented golfer, but you don't have to be to enjoy the sport, which is the wonderful thing about it. And so I learned a lot about the fundamentals of what is a governing body. What does sport administration mean? How do you think about setting rules? How do you think about fair play? How do you think about athlete development? How do you think about amateur status? How do you think about some of the really important fundamental issues in sport? And it was my opportunity to learn and to do all of that, all while focusing on the important pieces of driving revenue for an organization to fuel its mission. So that was terrific. Never in a million years did I think this opportunity would open its doors to me. But as a native of Colorado, I had always wondered if there were ever a day where I could have my professional and personal passions come together. This was an opportunity, and I put my hat in the ring, and here I am.
Yeah. Well, you said you're an emotional person. You respond to people who are being harmed. This is fascinating. You took over an organization in which athletes, the reason it was in that turmoil is that young people were being harmed. Now, you weren't working with them directly, but how did that equation impact your enthusiasm for or approach to taking this job?
I am such a believer in the fundamental role of sport in society that to watch that happening was heartbreaking. And it compelled me to lean in. And I will tell you, I have been in tears probably hundreds of times over the last 8 months. It has been an emotional roller coaster, both highs and lows. And that I'm in. I'm all in. You have to be all in. You have to love that, and you have to be ready to ride that emotional roller coaster to do this role. Yeah.
And it's an extremely complicated job. I would argue you have the most difficult job in all of sports.
Yeah, thank you for that.
It's true. The number of constituencies, 50 plus governing bodies, all these multi-sport organizations, all these single sport, non-NGBs, Congress, the public. The number of folks who have eyeballs on your organization and want something out of it. Yeah. And now all these lawsuits and everything else to work through. God bless you for taking this job.
Well, I think that the only way you can successfully do this job is to not be worried about losing this job. And so I came into this and said, all I can give this is my best. And if that isn't what our board of directors wants, then I have to be okay moving on to do the next thing. Because you can't be worried about making decisions, and you can't let that fear would be paralyzing. Fortunately, I have a great life partner, and he and I looked at each other and said, are we prepared to take this journey together? Because it will be a journey, and there will be days where it's hard, and all you can do is the best you can do. You're right. This is a tough job. I've had a number of people say, you realize, that this is going to come to an ugly end at some point. It's sort of like, geez, what a terrible thing to say. But if I can make a little bit of difference, it will have been worth every minute of it.
Yeah. It's one of the most political organizations out there. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just there's so many different constituencies that need to be talked to, and agendas organized and otherwise. You've been at this for a while. You've been listening to a lot of people. Yeah. How do you listen and whatever, make enough of them happy? Maybe that's not the right term. But at the same time, carve a vision, a bold vision that makes sense and is not going to make everyone happy. Yeah. How do you approach that?
The interesting challenge is trying to find common ground, trying to identify, your natural tendency when you listen to an individual or an individual group is to understand what they need and want to solve it. And I'm trying to figure out how to understand what those needs are, But before I jump in to try to solve them one at a time, it's a little bit of how do I find the common ground where there are thematics where we can kill sort of multiple birds with one stone, to use that phrase. And I think that's the important piece of the puzzle, is looking for systemic change that can permeate and touch a lot of different issues. But you have to do that in a way that also helps people recognize that you heard them. That you understand that 80% of their concern might be solved by the solution and not 100%. But that 80% is also going to solve 60% of this problem and 70% of that problem. And so in total, you've got something.
Yeah.
That's a huge challenge, but that's really the approach I'm trying to take, is to figure out how to, how do we resolve and move enough balls down the field that gives everybody progress, if not, a complete victory on all fronts. Because I'm not sure, to your point, I'm not sure that's actually feasible.
Right. And I know you're in the middle of a strategic planning process here.
Yeah.
That looks out many years. You had short-term fires to sort of deal with, and then there's, okay, where are we taking the organization? But based on where you are right now in the process, what do you see as the role of the U.S. Olympic Committee in our country? Not necessarily what it has been, although maybe you're saying, yeah, it is. It's exactly that. But what it can and should be in the lives of Americans and Olympians as well.
Yeah. So fundamentally, I walked into the organization at a moment in time that gave me both a mandate, but also the permission to make change, which is in some ways a gift, because creating change in a really well-established organization is not always an easy thing to do. In a moment of crisis, oftentimes you're given permission. That doesn't make it easy to get the work done, but it makes it easier to talk about the change. And so I walked into an organization that was really open to reevaluating its mission and core principles to start. You asked about values. It gave us an opportunity to say, let's take a step back and revisit, is our mission focused in the right place? And we went through that exercise, and we included a lot of those various constituent groups and individuals in the conversation, and ultimately did make not hugely significant changes to the mission, but some pretty significant statements to sort of the core principles, which I describe for our folks as kind of our North Star. And it really does focus on some fundamental things that are values that I hold dear, particularly around sport, not the least of which is, championing the safety and integrity of sport itself. That is so foundational to what sport is and what it represents, that's a really important part of how we go forward. You think about the role we play in athlete health and well-being. At the end of the day, our mission and our purpose as an organization is to create and enable and empower our country's best athletes to reach their highest potential. And so there are a lot of pieces of that puzzle, but broad health and wellness in achieving your highest potential is critical. And that's an important piece of where we're focused, is thinking about what are all the tools and resources and the environments that we have to create to ensure that our country's greatest athletes can achieve that potential and can achieve, their greatest mark of human performance. Fundamentally, that's what inspires all of the rest of us. It's why we're Olympic fans. It's why we watch, because the achievement of human potential creates hope. It creates inspiration. It makes us feel really good emotionally to watch other people achieve something that we know took grit and hard work and discipline and all of these things that we sort of aspire to. So fundamentally, our role is to empower and enable these athletes. But when you say to what end is for the inspiration of a nation, right? It's the inspiration of creating and displaying all of these really important values that is what is so foundational to sport, and why we love it and why it's important in society.
Terrific. We'll talk a little bit more about the big picture later in the conversation. But I want to go narrow here for a little bit and talk about some of your current reforms that you put in place. First of all, let me just get your diagnosis. The sexual abuse scandals in gymnastics and other NGBs, How do you diagnose what went wrong from a governance perspective?
Well, you cannot, first, let me say, we, the Olympic community, collectively failed our athletes. And it's a terrible, terrible, terrible situation, story. And you're right, it goes beyond gymnastics. And quite frankly, it goes beyond sport, unfortunately. We're watching this happen in society. The reality is we cannot have an environment or a culture where an athlete doesn't feel 100% comfortable speaking up, doesn't know where or how to speak up, and an organization that doesn't know what to do with that information when it is given. And so we're working really hard on a couple sides of the sort of abuse front, if you will. One is awareness, prevention, training, sort of the side of it that says, how do we make sure this doesn't happen? But there's also the side of it that says, but when you have a bad actor, how well do you handle it and how well do you deal with it? And both of those are equally important and areas where we've invested quite a bit of time and energy, not the least of which is also in what was the incubation of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, incubated within the USOC, spun out in early 2017 as an independent organization, quite frankly, in advance of sort of the crisis, if you will. That Center for Safe Sport was being spun up and developed. Incredibly difficult environment for that organization to be spun up and developed and then have, sort of crisis hit. But that's an important piece of the puzzle as we think about, the importance of independence in looking at this issue and managing when things do go wrong. Don't ever want there to be a perceived or real conflict of interest that says they're going to try to hide something because it's in their best interest to do so. And so really important that we set the stage, to make sure that there's not perceived conflict of interest, but also that we set a culture in our organization that rewards speaking up, that rewards prevention behaviors, that incents training, incents awareness, and we're making progress on that. But really, when you say, where do you need to be? We need to be in a place where when every parent makes a determination to put their child into a youth sport program, that a part of that behavior is going to the centralized database and saying, do I know who's coaching my child? And do I know who owns the gym or the pool or the rink where my child is training? And is this person on a banned, suspended, sanctioned list, or are they not? Do they have the right coaching certifications? Am I putting my child in the hands of people who have proven that they can do this and that they can handle the environment, or is there question there? We have a long way to go for that to be a behavior like brushing our teeth. We're not there, and we've got work to do. We've got work to do on the technology side. We've got work to do on the database side of getting the right individuals there. And then we've got a lot of work to do on the cultural and behavioral side to make sure that we all recognize that each of us plays a role in eradicating abuse in sport, all of us.
What about the financial side? There's been some conversation around, is the Center for Safe Sport sufficiently funded to do what it's saying it's going to do? And so far it's focused largely on sexual abuse, but physical and emotional abuse are also part of its purview.
That's right. And frankly, when you look at the mandate of the Center for Safe Sport, the breadth of it is absolutely enormous. And we're talking about a population of probably somewhere between 15 and 20 million covered individuals. That organization is inherently has exclusive sort of legal jurisdiction. That is a massive, massive agency for the work of what today is, I don't know their staff numbers, but it's 30, 40, maybe 50 individuals. This is a very small, still growing organization. So underfunded over time, there's no question it's going to require significantly more funding than what they have today. It's also going to require significantly more scale than where they are today, which requires growth in human resources, growth in infrastructure. I mean, it's a little bit of a startup organization managing a mature market size demand, and it's a real challenge.
And where's that money going to come from? I mean, you're funding it. and
We
and
are.
USOC has given whatever it's been asked
That's
of
correct.
the Center for Safe Sport. So where's it? Is this government money?
That's our hope.
Yeah.
I spent all day yesterday asking for just that.
Did you get it?
No, not yet. And we'll keep asking. I mean, the reality is we absolutely have an obligation to contribute and support, and it's important to us, and we'll continue to do that. But were we to be the only funding source, it would draw down the resources of our organization so dramatically that we would be making very difficult choices about where we're not investing our dollars. And that's just that's a very real reality that we're all going to have to manage our way through and figure out what the right solution is. We are hoping that the federal government will help.
I know this is not your primary consideration here, but as the joint venture comes together with LA and 28 and sponsorships are getting signed and otherwise, what are sponsors telling you about what they want to see from the U.S. Olympic Committee and this situation in general for them to have confidence to step forward in a significant way?
Yeah, certainly the amazing thing is that so many of our sponsors have said to me, when you've got the pathway forward and you've got the solutions, let us know because we want to be part of it. The reason that these organizations support the Olympic movement is the same set of values, the same set of programs, the same set of beliefs that we've talked about already. They too understand the role of sport in society. They too understand the inspiration, the motivation, the emotional attachment that we have to it. And so they want to be part of solutions, inclusive of this is a societal issue that many of them want to be part of, not because they want to be part of negative stories, but because they want to be part of the improvement of society. And the opportunity to be part of that is meaningful. But we've got to create the right platforms and the right stories and the right pieces of that puzzle, because it is difficult. It is difficult for a sponsor, and as you know, gymnastics lost a number of its sponsors in that process. Fortunately, our sponsors have been, incredibly supportive, but acutely responsible for their organizations and their organizations' brands, as they should be. So we have ongoing dialogues about where are the right places to plug in. Everybody also recognizes that in spite of the challenges, in spite of the abuse scandal, there are still hundreds, thousands of incredible athletes out there training every day, working really hard with their eye on Tokyo, and nobody wants to let them down. And so the support there is, let's not take our eye off of that ball. It would be unfair to that base of athletes to, quote, forget about them. So we've got to manage not allowing this to be a distraction, or to our efforts to be deterred from what we're doing, while at the same time making some pretty significant change and spending a lot of time on some other issues.
Beyond getting more money out of the federal government, which will have to come through Congress, I guess, what do you see as the role in Congress moving forward, maybe providing oversight or otherwise? I mean, Ted Stevens, he was the godfather of the Sports Act. He passed. Nobody really picked up the baton. Nobody really was holding the U.S. Olympic Committee or the NGBs accountable, Congress was not providing any level of appropriate oversight. So you can almost see why, well, if nobody's watching us, why do we get, as you think about your equation moving forward here, what do you see as the role of Congress in being a useful actor here in getting this right?
Well, the proposal that we've sort of coordinated on our end is to create an annual report. Whether Congress reads that, whether anybody grabs onto it, whether anybody does anything with it, I can't control that, but I can control our own transparency, and I can control our own process. Oftentimes, for us, forcing ourselves to write the report is probably the best self-accountability measure we can do, because it forces you, they say the things you measure are the things you'll change. So if in fact we are measuring ourselves against a set of standards, we will make that transparent. We will put that into the public sector and into Congress, and whether Congress grabs onto it or not will be at its discretion. But we'll do our part in making sure that we're evaluating our organization and the Olympic community on an annual basis. Right now, the Act mandates an every 4-year reporting. That's simply, that's a long time in this day and age. It's just crazy, and there's no reason that we can't do that on an annual basis. So we'll push forward with that, and we'll really look at some key measures, grievances, and there are a lot of provisions in our bylaws that allow us to track and keep track of how things are going. How do we get a really strong athlete feedback mechanism so that we have a good sense of that? How do we think about what the right measures are, and then report against them? Quite frankly, it'll be good for us.
Yeah, yeah. The USOC historically has been opposed to revisiting the Amateur Sports Act, opening it up, because you never know what's going to happen if you do, right? But it is an unfunded mandate. It does have this ambiguous language in places. What's your current perspective on whether the act should be revisited?
Yeah, it's a great question. The work that we've done to date, looking at reforms that need to happen, we've had a pretty collaborative effort inside our organization with the NGBs and the NGB Council, with the Athletes Advisory Council community, and I'm sure you'll talk to Max and Han about this later this morning, looking at where are the changes that we can make to improve our governance, improve our operating structure, et cetera. My sense is that probably about 80, maybe even 90% of that are things we can change in our own bylaws and our own areas of focus, if you will, potentially even filtering to NGB bylaws. So when you get to what's needed in the act itself, there are things that if they open the act, we think that could be helpful to refine, clarify, make some adjustments. But there's nothing here that says we can't make the changes we need to make as an organization and as a community to make the progress we need to make if they do nothing with the act. So I'm in the place of, if there's a discussion to legislate and open the act, we'll participate in that discussion. We will make some recommendations. If that doesn't happen, it's not going to hold us back from the progress we need to make.
Right. When you took the job, you said that we must protect, this is your quote, we must protect, support, and empower athletes, young and old, elite and beginner. So what do you see as the USOC's role, which there's some language in the Amateur Sports Act around that, role in coordinating the base of the sports system that lies underneath the podium?
So one of the core principles that we've established as an organization is we have an obligation to set standards. We have an obligation to set standards, to audit against those standards, to hold ourselves and to hold the NGB community accountable to those standards. So said another way, we've got to set the right example. And we've got to hold ourselves accountable to that example. And if we do that and we're successful, ultimately that's leadership, right? And then we're in a position where others can look to us who are sport administrators in a variety of capacities, in a variety of organizations, as a model for how to think about how to do things the right way. That's an important piece of our role and our obligation. We've done a lot of that in different areas, and I think the key is to make really clear and be really tight about what those standards are, what those best practices are, and how to make it very readily clear and be accessible to others, so that we are allowing for some consistency across a sport ecosystem. And there is an incredible amount of really good work that happens between our organization and the NGB community today that's probably not as well organized and coordinated as it could be to really set that standard broadly.
Right. There are a number of other countries have gone through this process as well in recent years, over the past decade or so. Germany, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, others. And what they've done is not just look at what's happening at the Olympic level, but really develop a sports system, a sport ecosystem that maps up to a particular vision and how it all integrates. What does good athlete development look like here, and here? What are the goals? How does it map to public health or otherwise? This idea of sport for all, which we use a lot in our Project Play work, is central to it all. And so it's a recognition that there's sort of a long-term process. And probably the nation that I mentioned earlier that has impressed me the most there's this tiny nation called Norway that did so well at the recent Olympics. So what I'd like to do is play a clip, a 2-minute clip from this a piece on HBO Real Sports that aired last night, where they went over there. Correspondent John Frankel did, and producer Nick Dolan, and reported out what exactly their system is and the importance of what happens at the base, and the recognition about how valuable that is by even the top Olympic officials. So, Jennifer, could we play that? Maybe she react.
To see how the typical Norwegian kid gets their start, we visited a youth skiing club in Lillehammer on a typical Tuesday night. It seemed that every child in town was there.
It's cold, it's about 15 degrees, it's 7 o'clock at night. I see, a couple hundred kids out here.
Yeah, this is quite normal.
Per Vangen helps run the program, which costs a mere $60 for 6 months of skiing fun. Norwegian officials require that sports program costs are kept low so that all kids can participate.
And we send the invoice only once. If you're not able to pay, you can still come.
And if somebody doesn't send in a check,
That's okay.
You
as
don't
well.
bother them.
No, we don't bother them.
The coaches here are not expensive professionals, but volunteers, like Dr. Christian Holm.
How would you assess the talent out here? Because I see some kids who look very skilled and others not so much.
I don't like the word talent. I think those are skilled. They have been doing lots of skiing since they were very small. And those who are not so talented, as we see them now, if they do skiing a lot until they are 15, 16, you might not see any difference.
Dr. Holm told us that the kids here do race, but the times and rankings are not kept.
Do you share the times with them, the results?
In Norway, it's not allowed to have lists where we order number 1, number 2, number 3.
You can't rank them.
Not before the age of 12. And that's that's not allowed in Norway for kids.
And the emphasis on fun, well, that was pretty obvious.
If the fun part is not essential, they will get tired of it. And they will just stop doing it. So we have to have fun. And skiing is fun. It's one of the most fun things you can actually do.
Until you fall and break a wrist, as I have.
Right?
So
That tends not to deter people from continuing to do it, amazingly.
no, what the heck, right? So that's a 2-minute clip. I did, in advance of our conversation, to help you prep for this, I sent you a long document about what Norway's model looks like, well beyond what I wrote about in the Times or in that particular piece or otherwise. Give me some just initial reflections. I mean, when you watch that, when you read what you have, is there anything about Norway's model, in full recognition this is a tiny country, in Europe that has a different, healthcare system, different approach to educate, different country in many ways.
Right.
Similar in many ways, but different country in many ways. Is there anything that you see in the Norway model that is worth exploring as we move forward in this country?
Sure. I mean, clearly there's some great stuff in there. The focus on, the breadth of participation is admirable. I know we would all love for more young people in this country to be participating in sport of some flavor than are. And I'm not sure. I think based on your work, you'd probably tell me that trend is going in the wrong direction, which is not great news. And so we all want there to be broad participation. And I think for that broad participation to happen, I mean, in many ways, they hit the nail on the head by saying it has to be fun. And the intensity has to be measured around that and particularly for young people. I know you're familiar with some of the work we've done around the American development model, and it's a pretty important piece of work as you think about, how do you balance the fun of sport and the benefits that you want children to have from it at different stages in their development. There's so much work being done and that's been done around youth development, human development at different points in your life, different ages. And there are some sports that have really taken that American development model to heart and employed it in a way that's, very disciplined and structured, and I think is seeing some really good results. So you look at how do we make sure that as we're bringing young people into the pipeline and into the system of sport, that you're balancing the pure enjoyment of it with also the appropriate development aspects of what you're asking of and expecting of a child at different phases in their development. And also that you're then thinking about when and how you're inserting performance measures against it. Rankings, you heard them talk about rankings, winning. What does that look like? And when is the right time to start to introduce these concepts, including, by the way, when is the right time to help individuals understand what winning and losing is, not just for the point of winning, but also in the really important life lessons of how to lose and what that means and what you do with that emotion and what you do with that learning and how you turn that into a positive. So I think there's a lot to be learned there, and I'm not sure that in this country there is a widespread, consistent agreement or alignment in what youth sports should look like and how young people should be brought into sport. A lot of youth sport today is being driven by the for-profit sectors and private enterprise. And oftentimes those incentives may not be aligned with what is in the best interests of children staying in sport for the long term or getting the right benefits out of sport.
The way Norway creates that alignment is through a document called the Children's Rights in Sport. There's nothing like it in the world. 8-page document that says every child in this country deserves a sport experience that has these features to it, that they have their voice built into it. It empowers them as opposed to the coaches necessarily. And then it says, here's what you can't do. And if you do, then you just won't get government money, government grants for facilities or funding or otherwise. A document that initially, when they put it in place in 1987, people said, hey, come on, don't tell me what to do with my kids, or don't tell me what to do with my club, whatever. Now it's like a universally accepted and a critical document, even by the folks at the top Olympic level, that look at 12 and under, this needs to be a protected zone. It needs to be about development. It needs to be about, as they call it, joy of sport for all. Is there room, and can you see in some form or another a children's rights in sport framework being put in place in this country, as large and disjointed as it is? And if so, in what form?
I am wary of more unfunded mandates. And my sense is that it has worked so effectively in Norway because it is not an unfunded mandate. It is a very funded mandate. And so there's incentive there. So the question is, to be effective in this country, how do you create incentive in a meaningful way? How do you create leverage so that you really can impact behavior and impact outcomes? So I don't have the answer to that or the solution to that, but I'm wary about us putting something on a piece of paper that remains something on a piece of paper, as opposed to a really actionable and impactful sort of mandate or system. I think to have consistency and alignment around something so powerful as to say this is the fundamentals would be terrific. But it would be maybe detrimental if, in fact, all it was a declaration that had no teeth.
Could those funds be raised from either government or foundations or individuals or corporate sponsors? Because you're right, Norway does have that funding piece. In their case, it's gambling money. 65% of it goes back into the sport system. Partly funds their Olympic activities, but most of it goes down to community clubs. And how optimistic are you that support could be generated around that?
I won't say I'm optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic. I will leave that open to say it's interesting. It's interesting. There are an enormous number of demands on the same sources of revenue in and around sport. And so each of those sources, whether it's an individual who has real capacity and real passion for sport, whether it's a corporation that's a sponsor or an investor in sport, whether it's the government. I mean, everybody is drawing on the same sources of revenue for a lot of different things. So I can't sit here and say that I'm optimistic that it could happen, but I'm also not pessimistic. This country has some amazing people, some amazing organizations, and the amazing capacity to do incredible things when you can get focused and aligned.
Got it. Yeah. So one question we're going to open up to the crowd here. So having said that, the U.S. Olympic Committee already is starting to step into this space in a meaningful and important way. You've created the How to Coach Kids website with a free course, the first free course available to any organization out there that wants to introduce key competencies to their youth coaches. In full transparency, it's a partnership of Aspen, U.S. Olympic Committee, and Nike put that together. You've also created parent tip sheets, about 36 of them that are now on your website, and we within Project Play, we're going to elevate as well through our network of stakeholder organizations. Is that one place where the U.S. Olympic Committee can be really useful, is creating tools and resources that are available for use for the incredible number of organizations out there?
I think it goes back to the comment I made about setting standards and setting an example. There are aspects. Fundamentally, I have conversations regularly that end up either start focused on coaching or end up focused on coaching. It is a critical piece. Your work has illustrated that very same issue. Real opportunity for improvement, for growth, for advancement in and around coaching. There's no doubt about it. There are also a lot of organizations, individuals focused on it. And so the aggregation and convening of a conversation around coaching, coach development is important, and I think is one area where we can help from a leadership perspective, set standards, set examples, do some really good things. And that is an area, I'll go so far as to say I am optimistic about the work being done against coaching, the importance of coaching education. All of that to say, where we will play is in what I'll call the sport neutral zone. So individual national governing bodies have incredible expertise in how to teach, how to develop athletes in a sport. Our role is how to develop athletes in a sport neutral space. When you get to sport specific, then you start to look to the expertise of a national governing body and a sport organization. And so it's an important partnership with the NGB community in that way.
And and Max Cobb, who's on our next panel, will talk about this as well. Could the USOC ask more of the NGBs in pushing out best practices and maybe even incentivizing or mandating them in some way or another, like turning in an annual report on, okay, where are you with participation? Where are you with coach training? Where are you with diversity? Where are you with all these key metrics that, frankly, we follow within Project Play here on an annual basis? But we can't tell the NGBs what to do or really create the incentives there. How do you feel? Any initial thought on the opportunity there?
I think I would say it a little bit differently, which is we have an obligation to help the NGBs understand how to create those kinds of measures so that they too can measure themselves against a defined set of criteria and areas of focus. For us to ask more of the NGBs as an authority is probably, it's certainly not the approach that I intend to take. My approach is, how do we help the NGBs be successful? There are areas where we can create consistency across NGBs, and we can be very helpful to them in helping them think through what effective and strong sport administration looks like. And there are a number of areas where their expertise will prevail, and we'll learn from them. Their sport expertise is really important. It's a symbiotic relationship. Yes, we play a role. Yes, there's some authority and accountability, but first and foremost, our job is to do everything we can to help make them successful.
Got it. Okay, so let's go to a few questions here. First hand that went up is way in the back.
Tony Batt, I'm a reporter for Gambling Compliance. Tom mentioned the gambling money in Norway earlier. How concerned are you now that we see this expansion of sports betting in the United States? Is that a serious concern for you? And how closely are you going to be watching that with regard to how athletes might be impacted?
It certainly has to be something we pay close attention to, but I wouldn't describe my state as one of concern. It's one of attention. I think that, as Tom suggested, could there be benefits? I would love to believe that it benefits sport, but there will also be implications and considerations that we all have to pay close attention to. So I wouldn't describe myself as concerned about it, but certainly acutely aware, and we'll continue to be focused on it. And as I said at the outset, the integrity of sport is foundational, and we have to maintain the integrity of sport. And if in any instance gambling or betting starts to infringe on the integrity of sport, then I very quickly get concerned.
Over here.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to.
She's gonna.
My name is Caroline Podolicchio. My question is, many of my former teammates are ambassadors for the women's hockey movement right now. So I was wondering if there's a role that the U.S. Olympic Committee can play in that movement for the future betterment of women's hockey.
So I will tell you, I am incredibly proud of our organization's history in, sort of equity in pay and equity in benefits across gender. And there's an incredible conversation happening right now on that issue across many sports. I'm glad the conversation's happening. I hope that we continue to push, and I cannot wait until the day when women and men are compensated equally in sport. We're not there.
Let's go here.
Hi, we've talked a lot about the negative, and you brought up Norway as an example of a real positive. But Sarah, as you look across the landscape of the NGBs and maybe even at the club level, are there beacons of hope that you see and people really doing it right? And maybe could you share those, if you see them?
100% yes. There is, fundamentally, there is incredible work being done every day at all levels of the ecosystem. Large, sort of very popular sports down to what are the lesser known, smaller organizations and NGBs. The scale and size of a national governing body is not reflective of its success, if you will, from an operating perspective. There are incredible organizations doing really, really good work in developing athletes at the grassroots level all the way through to the elite level, preparing coaches, creating education programs. So there's an incredible amount of really, really good work that's happening, and I would tell you across a number of sports. As you know, we've got 50 national governing bodies. I'm still not sure if you put me to the test that I can name all 50 in one sitting. But we joke about it all the time. The diversity, and that's just the Olympic and Paralympic program in this country. When you get outside those bounds, the number of individuals that are participating in a diversity of sports is incredible. There are new sports coming into the program that are growing at a really, really rapid rate. So there's a lot of great things happening, and you're right. We tend to spend more time talking about the things that are either broken or need fixing or aren't going well. But I can assure you, I spend as many days having fun and celebrating successes as I do working on the hard stuff. No doubt about it. And thank you for raising that.
In the front here, third row.
One of the key differences between the United States and the rest of the world is here in this country, sports is based on a scholastic model in our school system, whereas the rest of the world is more on a club basis. What role do you see for the USOC in terms of impacting scholastic programs down to the elementary and middle schools? And secondly, you're seeing in some sports where athletes are gravitating away from their school participation to focus solely on their club participation.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I don't have enough background and enough data to be able to really articulate the extent to which those trends are happening. we have spent a bit of time over my 8 months with the NCAA and focused on the collegiate system. So one thing I'll point out is there are a number of Olympic and Paralympic sports that do have sort of feeder pipeline systems in the collegiate space through the NCAA, but there are quite a few that don't. And there are a number of very healthy, vibrant sports in this country that are not driven through a scholastic model. So there are disparate models that are in play. Clearly, the scale and development that we see more broadly are in the places where the collegiate system is supporting it. And in a lot of cases, the pipeline into the collegiate system may or may not start in a high school or an elementary school, may come from a club, a neighborhood, a community, something of that nature. But I will tell you that in the time I've spent internationally, there is no doubt that the system that we have in this country is the envy of the world. There is enormous envy for the NCAA system in particular. And in a lot of cases, when you look at the athletes competing on the world stage in the Olympic and Paralympic Games, a lot of those athletes, not only from our country, but other countries, are being trained here in our collegiate system. So it's a very powerful thing that we are acutely aware of what an asset it is, and the NCAA and its institutions are a really important partner in sport overall. And the athletes who are coming through that system, many of them may not go on to compete at the Olympic or Paralympic level, but continue on in, I'll call it, paying it forward in and around sport and society. And that's a huge benefit that we do have in this country.
Mm-hmm. One last one, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Kristen Airgood, and I am a trustee of the USOC. And my question is really around the first sentence of the second paragraph of the introduction for today, that some argue that heightened focus on medals laid the groundwork for sexual abuses that emerged in USGA. And while that may have a role to play in it, I'm wondering with both of you, this is actually a question for both of you, it seems to me that a deeper issue is around silence and not believing. And the silencing of girls, boys, and a lack of belief when they tell us these things are happening, and that goes way beyond desiring a medal. And so my question for each of you is, Sarah, we've talked about this quite a bit, but what specifically is the USOC doing to open ears and to actually deeply listen? And then, Tom, I'd love to understand how this issue is playing out in the Aspen Institute's work as well, because it's critically important for this to be grounded in where it actually sits, which is a culture of secrecy and silence and a lack of belief around children telling us the truth.
Thanks, Kristen. So I'll start in saying I think that the culture of silence or the fear of speaking up is fundamental and foundational to what we're seeing, and it is true in cases of abuse. It is also true in other areas. Particularly when you're looking at elite athletes, their right to compete and their spot on a team or their spot in a competition is really, really critically important. And so anything in their mind that creates the perception that could hamper that ability, or themselves in the mind of their coach, themselves in the mind of the administrator who might be making or influencing a decision about their role on a team, starts to create real anxiety for the athlete community. And if there's anything I've heard in all my conversations with athletes, it's around, I don't want to show weakness to a coach, and that becomes as we start talking about mental health, that becomes a real issue. I don't want to do anything that would put me in the eyes of the coach as a troublemaker, as flagged for, do I really want this person? Are they going to create problems for our team? And so fundamentally, we have to create safe spaces and safe environments where athletes, where coaches, where administrators, where parents can speak up without any fear of any kind of retaliatory behavior. We talk a lot about whistleblower policies and making sure that we have the right provisions in place, but also the right outlets in place for them to speak up where they feel safe. And there's no question that we are not there yet, and we've got a lot of work to do to create those environments, not just around abuse, but around things like mental health and some other really important issues.
And I would add that the, Play One, if you're familiar with the Project Play playbook, it's 8 strategies for the 8 sectors that touch the lives of kids. Number 1 is ask kids what they want. How do you bring the voice of children into the design of sport experiences, and just empower them in general so they can speak up, so their voice matters. So I think it's a matter of like designing programs that are intentional that way. I would also say that we do a lot of work asking people about when do performance environments need to begin versus participation environments. This is one good thing that Norway does. They haven't had this problem, at least at the level that we have. It's in part because they say, really at 13 and under, it is not a performance environment. It basically needs to be local play, so kids aren't going off to faraway places with someone they don't know. They're not in rooms with people. There's a commitment to sport for all, so like if you lose your spot on this team, there's another team for you to go play on. So you're more empowered in that kind of way. So it's very volunteer driven, and they make sure the volunteers are trained. They know what the children's rights in sport concept looks like. And therefore there are a lot of families around. So if you're around your parents, you're less likely to be in situations where you're alone with someone who might abuse you. So I think there's a real conversation that needs to be had about how to structurally do we put in place ways of delivering sport experiences that kids bad things don't happen to them, and you don't have the silence issue to deal with later on. So anyway, well, listen, we're going to conclude here. I will say, first of all, thank you, Sarah. This is an incredible conversation. And I think many would agree with what I'm about to say here, which is you bring great heart and you bring a great mind to a major challenge, and wish you the best and wish the Olympic Committee the best. It's a critical organization in getting sports right in this country. So go forth and conquer. So,
thank you for having me.
Conversation. So with that, I would like to introduce our next panel, or more specifically, the moderator for our next panel, who is John Solomon, the editorial director on our Sports and Society team. John is a former reporter with CBS Sports for many years, has won dozens of national awards. He authors many of our authors or edits some of our State of Play reports. He is involved in helping design everything we deliver in this program. And so why don't you come on up, John, and I'll let you lead the rest of this here.
Great. You're at the end there. You come on up. Yeah. You grab a seat right here. On your next time. Great, thank you. Great, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Sarah, for a really thoughtful conversation. Appreciate it. So we just heard from the USOC some about reforms and their vision and some of the challenges for the future. Now we want to hear from some additional voices about the future of the U.S. Olympic movement and the Paralympic movement. Just a quick reminder, we will have a brief audience Q&A at the end, so be thinking of any questions you have, and continue to join the conversation on Twitter. You can follow us at Aspen in Sports and use the hashtag Aspen Sports Lab. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. I really appreciate you all being here. First, to my immediate left, we have Shannon Miller. Shannon remains one of the most decorated Olympic gymnasts in history, with 7 medals, 2 gold, 2 silver, 3 bronze. At the 1996 Games, she led the Magnificent Seven to the first gold medal for the U.S. women's team. Shannon is now an advocate for the health and wellness of women and children. She promotes Athlete Safety Matters, which is an evidence-informed curriculum that educates youth athletes with strategies to prevent, recognize, and respond to all types of abuse and bullying. Next to Shannon, we have Xiao. Han has been chair of the U.S. Olympic Committee Athletes Advisory Council since 2017. The council was responsible for broadening communication between the USOC and active athletes. As a table tennis athlete, Han represented Team USA in 4 World Championships and 1 Pan American Games. Next to Han, we have Max Cobb. Max is president and CEO of the US Biathlon, which supports the development of biathlon in the United States and prepares athletes for international competition, including the Olympic Winter Games. Max is also chair of the National Governing Bodies Council. The council represents the consensus views of the NGBs to the US Olympic Committee Board of Directors and its staff. And finally, we have Cindy Bourne. Cindy is a national sports reporter at the Washington Post. She has covered the Olympics and reported on the gymnastics sexual abuse scandal and mental health issues for Olympians and other athletes. So thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. I want to start with a fundamental question that can help set up this conversation. And that is, what role do you think the USOC and the NGBs should have in our country? Tom talked about this earlier, not necessarily what it currently is, although that may be your answer, but what do we aspire for them to be? Let's just briefly start, Cindy, if you want to take a first stab at that.
You know, I think they do such a good job with an umbrella, a large umbrella, but what about granularly? You know, what about on the individual level? I think that's where we saw the failure with USA Gymnastics and in other areas. I think, you know, it's what Tom was talking about with Norway. You know, there's more to it than just sort of administering a sport, you know, or administering all of sports and sort of doing the business of sports. You know, what about the human level? And I think that's something that has not really been addressed that closely until an athlete, you know, becomes really, really famous, really successful. Then it changes. But does it change for everyone? You know, does that lift all athletes?
Max, what do you think? I mean, you're right there with the NGBs. You're chair of that council. What do you think, and what do you hear from NGBs?
Yeah, you know, we would look back through history. We look when the Sports Act was created, but probably the greatest influence on sport in America was Title IX. And I think that we're reaching a point now where we need to look a little bit beyond the horizon and decide what is the next great step forward for sport in America. And I think that, you know, Tom touched on a little bit there. There's a fundamental lack of funding in the United States that makes sport and Olympics, too many Olympic sports out of reach of children in America. And we need to get our arms around that. We need to have the dialogue that will lead to a solution going forward there. And I think that's something that the United States Olympic Committee, together with the NGBs, together with the AAC, is uniquely positioned to do.
Han, what do you think?
I think the USOC and the NGBs really are there to create a strategy to help us harness the power of sport, to inspire people and to create those platforms where athletes can, you know, realize their maximum potential and to go out and inspire people. And I think the tragedy of what we've seen with Nassar and some of these other scandals is that I think it's a really big blow to the ability of sport to do that when people do see that ugly side of what's going on rather than focusing on the positive impact of sport on society.
First of all, thank you for having us here today. I think, you know, having these conversations is really important. Some things will work, some things won't work, but at least we're having the conversation. Cindy talked about kind of the granular level. I'll kind of go the opposite way because they're both important. When I think about the future of sport and USOC, the NGBs, I'm taken back to the Olympic ideals. What are the Olympic ideals and values, the value of excellence and respect and friendship, the mission of making athletes the heart of the Olympic movement. So if we kind of start there, then I think we have to look at athletes as the whole athlete. The athlete experience, not just on that day of competition, but the entire athlete journey from the grassroots level to the podium. And the day you step off the podium, that does not mean you've left the Olympic movement. And I think NGBs and the US Olympic Committee are uniquely positioned, better than probably any other organization in the world, to help athletes, to help high caliber athletes compete on the world stage, but they are also uniquely positioned to help athletes during that pre-experience, but also during their post-career and transitioning to their next career. So I think really that focus on the entire athlete experience is really important.
So when we talk about focusing on athletes, who do we define as being the athletes, right? I mean, is it only those who have Olympic potential or they've won Olympic gold? Is it the next level down? Maybe they're sort of elite and they've got a chance to get there. Do we go all the way down, to youth sports and to grassroots? And should it be everyone in our country? How do each of you define who the USOC, who the NGB should be representing? Anyone? Jenny, you want to start?
Sure. I guess I would personally define athletes as those who want to participate. I think if an athlete wants to play, they should have the opportunity to play. And that's what the Olympics is all about. And I think that does have to start at the youth sport level. Not that the USOC should own the youth sports organization or that plan, but I think it does have to start at that grassroots level. What's devastating to me is to hear that athletes are turned away from a sport because they got cut from a team at 11 years old. That 9-year-old that wanted to play a certain sport is kind of turned away because they didn't start early enough. To me, that is heartbreaking. It's not what sport is about. Sport is not about being good on day one. Sport is about the challenge. It's about learning. It's about failing and then getting back up and having the opportunity to try again. And so I think when we focus on youth sports, whether it's a partnership, collaboration, this idea of best practices and trading techniques and all of these things, and I think the learning goes both ways, but I think involving those Olympic ideals, Olympism in the youth sports area, it inspires children. And when we talk about the Olympic movement, we're not just talking about the next Olympic gold medalist. We are talking about the 6-year-old today that is tomorrow's Olympian, but they might be tomorrow's official, judge, coach, volunteer, fan, and yeah, maybe an Olympic gold medalist. So I think it does start from the grassroots level.
Han, how do you
I would 100% agree with Shannon, because I think, as she said, the people who even leave sport or who never make it to that stage, if you go and look at any of our NGBs, those are the people who are there nights, weekends, they're giving up all of their lives other than their day jobs to make that sport successful. And they're a huge part of our community. Anyone who's been in one of our sports knows that. And so those people who are giving up their lives to participate, we need to also be thinking about them. I think there's more than just a resource allocation question. Certainly there's always a resource issue because we have an unfunded mandate of who you're going to put the resources in. But when we're talking about, for example, impacting sport culture and what the USOC can do to influence that, I think we're talking about everyone down to youth sport and the base of the pyramid there.
Max, what do you think?
Yeah, it's been said already and more eloquently than I can. I would just add to that leadership is incredibly important, and that when we see NGBs embrace the responsibility to take care of their sport and nurture it from the grassroots level up, then we see a lot of success. And a good example of that was when USA Hockey basically completely revamped the way youth hockey takes place. They converted to cross-ice hockey. They stopped regional, national, or very young age national championships. They took a lot of bold steps to transform the way youth experienced hockey in the beginning, and it's really worked really well for them. I think, in my sport, in biathlon, we have only one American who ever has won a gold medal at the World Championships, Lowell Bailey, and I remember him starting the sport as a 12-year-old. So there is that depth that is really important. So I think it goes down to the grassroots level as well.
Cindy, what do you think? How do you define athletes relevant to the movement?
I think that what you're saying is true, and I think it's awful when an athlete is suddenly washed up, I don't know, when they're out of their teens, when an athlete ages into an adult body, their career is over. I think there has to be a way to kind of take them off that treadmill, that constant, it's sort of a rat race. And, if it begins when you're in your mid-teens and you're ready and able to accept that challenge and to grow into it, that's terrific. Otherwise, I don't understand why, younger kids, as Tom was discovering in Norway, aren't encouraged to participate. And, how many athletes can you name who who really weren't in the NFL, who weren't a #1 draft choice, or who weren't a top pick? I mean, Steph Curry wasn't a top pick. So I think if we pushed it back a little bit and sort of let everyone have fun, this is just my personal opinion, at a younger age, and encourage them to grow and develop to their full potential, then see where it takes them. Seems like it would be a lot healthier, and you wouldn't have athletes then, at the age of, 24, whose careers are over, who are battling depression and wondering about what comes next in their lives.
Max, speaking of Norway, I mean, we saw the clip earlier. You were just there last week, right?
I was, yeah.
You're there, you're familiar with the children's rights in sport model there. Is there anything that we can adopt from there, that the USOC, the NGBs can take from that model and perhaps apply to the grassroots here?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really interesting for me, I was there visiting a school that specializes in, high school specializes in development of cross-country skiers, biathletes, soccer players, and rifle marksmen. And I asked how the school came into being, how the facilities were created. And they talked about really a three partner process there. The first was what Tom talked about, that there is this pool of funds that are available to support sport and sport facilities through lottery and sport betting. The second was the sort of private-public partnership of the community working together with a sports club to develop the facility and develop the school there. So these three organizations, entities came together. But none of that would have happened without the resource of the sport betting money being there in order to partner with. And so I think that really is something that we should look at, the power of being able to put some resource out there that can be matched by the community, matched by the sport body in order to make things happen. And the program there is available to kids in the high school years. The only things that the parents have to pay for are the meals and lodging and the travel. So a total year at the school would probably cost something like $10,000. The coaches are retired national team coaches. The sport facilities are excellent. A similar program in the United States would cost $60,000 to $65,000 a year.
We've talked privately about having a performance plan for the grassroots, right? There's a performance plan right now, correct, for NGBs for elite athletes, and that's how you get the funding. What would be the value of having a grassroots performance plan, and is there a way to incentivize it in some ways for NGBs?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally there are some within Olympic sports, we're being massively outspent by the Chinese, the Russians, the Germans, the Austrians, the UK. But there are some things that we do better in the US than our competitors do, sort of fundamental advantages that we have. And one of them is to collaborate and share experiences, share best practices. And the model that the USOC uses of requiring every sport to be funded through their high performance sport plan allows an aggregation of all this information about how sport is being delivered to the top athletes in America and a sharing of best practices back to the individual sports. So we really benefit from each other's institutional knowledge. The same thing needs to happen at the youth sport level. There's a lot of good delivery that's being done by different NGBs, by different local communities. But we don't have any systematic way to aggregate that information and share it back to the community. And I think that's what, if we did require or ask or incentivize NGBs to put the same kind of effort into their youth sport development plan that we do into the high performance sport plan, I think that would yield great benefits. And Sarah kind of touched on it too, where she talked about how just the act of the U.S. Olympic Committee putting together their annual report drives good behaviors and makes the organization stronger. I think it's a similar case with the NGBs.
Yeah, say you all did a grassroots performance plan, Max, and others feel free to jump in as well. What data would you want NGBs to collect on behalf of the USOC so it's all systematic and you're looking at some of the the same numbers across different sports?
Yeah, I think data is one thing. I mean, we can track the measurable things of participation rates, of coaches training, of cost to athletes. I think those would all be really interesting things, but more organically, I think it's about the way they're able to integrate into a community to deliver sport at a more organic level and a more holistic level. And I think by looking at those things, we may be able to identify opportunities for NGBs to actually collaborate in more effective ways and be better partners to communities that are willing to support sport by working together.
Anyone else have any other thoughts?
I think maybe a couple of specific things I would find interesting. Maybe these are already being measured, I don't know. But I know for some sports, my sport included gymnastics, we have a different kind of rule book, so to speak, every 4 years, every quad. So we have the different code of points. And so what we see is if a certain move on bars is given more difficulty in this quad, we see more shoulder injuries. If a certain move on floor is being focused on that quad, then we see more knee injuries. And so following those trends in injury so that trainers and coaches can be prepared for that, be maybe ahead of the trend and help protect their athletes through workload or technique, that would be one thing. And the other thing that comes to mind is dropout rate. So in a variety of different sports, is there a certain age or a certain level when you're losing more athletes than kind of any other time? And what are those reasons? Are they moving to a different sport, or are we losing them from sport altogether? And maybe understanding some of those trends can help us keep kids in sport.
So I'll add to that by saying I have a pretty big passion for looking at the sport culture that we have and the coaching culture that we have, especially around athlete safety right now, but at a different time it could be a different issue. And so I'd be really interested in, our organization's ability to impact that, specifically, what does our coaching education look like, but also how many of the coaches working in that youth sport are maybe outside of our organization. Because one of our challenges is that when they're not members of the NGB or they're out with AAU or they're out with another affiliate organization, a lot of times we find that our leverage is fairly limited in terms of our ability to influence that. So I'd really be interested too in, what does the entire landscape of the sport look like so that we understand how do we become better stewards of the movement in terms of influencing that culture that I think is pretty important to athlete safety.
Let's talk about athlete safety now. Good segue there. We heard from Sarah some about the USOC reforms, the challenges as well to improve. It's horrific what happened in gymnastics, but it's not just gymnastics. We've seen it in swimming and taekwondo and figure skating and speed skating and in society as a whole as well. How do you think the USOC and NGBs are doing so far in trying to better protect athletes from abuse? And is there more that could be done? Cindy, do you want to
I think they're just beginning to address it. I think they're beginning to realize the depth of the problem, the breadth of the problem. It's pervasive. The people that I've talked to are saying, it crops up when someone files a lawsuit. It crops up when one person comes out and says something, and then, everyone else realizes, oh, it didn't just happen to me. I'm not the only person. That's why you see 200 plus women, so bravely confronting Larry Nassar at his trial. You're seeing it with a number of other sports as well. And I think, it's surprising to a degree, and I don't know how the organizations are exactly going to go about, preventing this, whether it's the access to psychological counseling, maybe having psychologists in some of the NGBs that are checking on, kids. But again, that's at a granular level, who does a kid go to? That was something one of the gymnasts told us, who was I going to go to? I wasn't going to go to my coach. That was the predator, or the doctor was the predator, and the coach is going to do something about it. His program's going to collapse, once this hits the news. And once there are lawsuits, there aren't a lot of places to go. And that's why it's so interesting to me to see athletes empowering themselves by speaking out, because they're so popular, they're so well known. When a US Gymnastics hires a medical director who isn't really someone that the gymnasts thought was qualified for the job, Simone Biles. One tweet to 1 million followers drew a lot of attention. And, you know, they changed medical directors after a day. You know, that's where it goes. I mean, that's where the power is in the voice and the platforms that the athletes have. You know, and I think that anything that can be done to sort of stimulate that is important, and it's important for empowering athletes.
I think to your question, you know, how are they doing? What have they done? You know, I think there can always be more that can be done. I think we could all agree that there's always more that we can do to create a safe environment for our athletes. And Sarah talked about a lot of the different angles they're pursuing and how difficult the issue and how many ways there are to go at it. And I think, you know, certainly a lot of the things that Sarah talked about. On top of that, I think one of the areas that I'm most interested in is the understanding and the importance of evidence-based education for our athletes. We talk a lot about training for coaches and administration and even volunteers, but I haven't heard a lot about educating our athletes on abuse prevention. And I think that's critical at every level. That's something that's really important to me that I would like to see a lot of, because I think if we did arm our athletes with, and the word empower is so often used, and it has to, I feel like it has to be backed up with tools, it has to be backed up by education, but let's empower our athletes with the tools that they can use so they know how to speak up, how to do so in a safe way, who they can speak up to, what are the red flags. I mean, this whole host of questions, and it goes beyond just sex abuse. It goes to emotional and verbal, it goes to neglect, it goes to bullying and cyberbullying and all of these other aspects that most of our kids are going to have to deal with at some point or another, whether it's in sport or not.
So along those lines, I mean, you're promoting something called Athlete Safety Matters, evidence-based curriculum that tries to give kids tips about victimization and how to respond and react, you know, to different types of abuse. What's really interesting to me is, to your point, you're focusing on the kids, on educating and empowering the kids. Normally we see prevention with the adults, with the coaches or the league organizers or the parents. Why the emphasis on kids, and some as young as kindergarten that are taking these courses?
Yeah, my daughter's in kindergarten. She's taking the course right now, and she's tough. So, but no, in less promoting than working with, the Monique Burr Foundation for Child Safety is just an incredible organization. I started volunteering with them about 2 years ago, and I just think their program is incredible. It is the only evidence-based comprehensive abuse curriculum for children available in the United States. That is incredible. They've trained over 3 million children in the last 11 years, and they had asked me, along with Donna Orender, who is the former president of the WNBA, to help with their task force with regard to their Athlete Safety Matters program. And basically, they have taken their incredible curriculum and they have geared it toward athletes in this program, along with creating additional modules that are sport-specific. Spotting and flexibility are going to be very different in gymnastics than it will be in another sport. And so that's really important to have a sport-specific model. I'm excited that the program has launched. I'm excited to be a part of it. I could talk about it for a long time. I won't do that. But I want to say that a few things that I would point out about the importance of education. One is the research-based, the evidence-based portion of this curriculum and of any curriculum, whether that's adult training or anything else. That's of critical importance. It speaks to me as someone that's data-driven. The comprehensive nature, because again, it goes back to, we're not just talking about sexual abuse, we're talking about all forms of abuse. And so with Monique Burr Foundation for Athlete Safety, we're talking about sexual abuse, neglect, emotional, physical, bullying, cyberbullying, internet safety. I mean, think of the young athletes that are on social media and getting bullied on social media at 11 years old. We have to prepare our children. We have to help them to navigate that. The other portion that I really appreciate is that it is age appropriate. And as a mom of a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old that are involved with multiple youth sports, when all of this started happening, yes, I see it from an athlete's perspective, but also as a mom. I did not know how to talk to my children about a subject like this. And I found myself just avoiding the conversation. And I also knew that's probably not the right thing to do because that's how this stuff flourishes, in secrecy, in silence. And with the athlete safety program, it not only helps children understand in an age-appropriate way. My 5-year-old gets different curriculum than my 9-year-old, who would get different curriculum than the 16-year-old. But it also means that now, as a parent, I'm seeing the stuff that they're bringing home. I'm learning about the curriculum. I can now have a dialogue with my child in a way that is safe for them, appropriate for them, but also teaches them the 5 safety rules that are the same regardless of whether it's sexual abuse or bullying or anything else. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You do not have to have a different program for every type of abuse, and that is a really important. This is part of what's kind of been researched thoroughly. That's part of kind of that idea that we don't have to remake this. The programs are out there, the education is out there. Let's utilize what we have. For me, and I'll just let it go after this, but I think to me the one thing that kept standing out was a statistic that I was told early on when I started working with Monique Burr, and that is that research shows that 95% of child sexual abuse can be prevented through education. 95%. I made them go back and triple, quadruple check that statistic over and over. 95%. So I think if we're not focused, if we're not viewing education, especially for our athletes, as a main driver in a solution and in helping protect our athletes, then we have to ask ourselves, are we really dedicated to protecting our athletes?
Yeah, I went through one of the courses. It's really well done for Athlete Safety Matters. Max, where does Congress play a role in all this in terms of the reforms? And what role should they play? And do you think that you and other NGBs want them to play? And what role do you think that they will have? And what might that look like?
Yeah, I guess just to not step away from education, because I want to make the point to Shannon that there are 2 main priorities for the Center for Safe Sport. One is the place where violations can be reported and followed up on and adjudicated. And the other piece is education. And so there is a massive work going on there. And I think it started with educating coaches, now it's educating parents, and now they're just beginning to put together the modules for educating the athletes and the children as well. So there is an effort being made at that level.
I hope. The evidence based is so critical. I'm
Well,
glad to hear
there's
I'm glad to hear it's in the pipeline.
Yeah, a lot to learn from your organization as well, for sure. As we get our arms around creating safe environments for athletes, we can look at a different model where Congress and the United States government played a critical role in changing sport culture, and that was through the United States Anti-Doping Agency. Currently, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency is the gold standard globally for anti-doping. And when we think about the fundamentals of sport, as Sarah said, fair, safe, fair, whichever order you want to put it in, those are absolutely fundamental pieces. And so I think the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency provides a really good model for what funding for the center could look like, for the Center for Safe Sport could look like as well, where the majority of the funding, a narrow majority of the funding is coming through the United States government, but a not insignificant portion is coming from the United States Olympic Committee and from the sport movement. And I think that's a really good model for us to pursue. And as we look to work with lawmakers, that's one of the things we're advocating for.
So Safe Sport now has a database that it tracks, some of the coaches out there who are banned for sexual misconduct. But we know there are gaps. We talked earlier about Safe Sport and the funding issues and some of the system level issues. How do you go about disseminating that information that someone is banned, as an NGB? And then also, how do you enforce the bans? I mean, right now, if someone's on that list, you're still an NGB pretty high up you're not at that grassroots level.
Yeah, that's right. So the just that everybody's on the same page here, the U.S. Center the U.S. Center for Safe Sport maintains a database of all the individuals who have been banned for some kind of sexual or abusive misconduct, so that anybody can go online and search by name for these people and make sure that the person who's coaching their children isn't one of them. I think one of the things I've been really advocating for is the requirement that the background check companies who do background checks for clubs that are hiring coaches, that background check that they do for sport includes the center's database. And I think that will make it a lot easier for club administrators, many of whom are mom and pop volunteers, to be able to know, okay, I did the background check before we hired this person and they didn't have anything come up, so they're not on the Safe Sport banned list either. I think that's a really important way forward. Certainly, as Han talked about, there are the programs over which the NGBs have some connection, member clubs, for example, and we do require background checks be done there. We do require that the Safe Sport Act is followed by our member clubs. The enforcement of that is a challenge because, as you say, in some cases we're a pretty small organization at the top and trying to influence a lot further down. But beyond that, there's a whole nother other sport institutions that are not connected with the NGBs, and we don't have any jurisdiction over those. So they're obligated to follow the federal law that was created in the Safe Sport Act, but we don't have any way to govern it.
But for instance, for a member, so an organization that's a member of USA Biathlon, can you enforce a coach ban? Look, a coach has been banned from your sport. You need to not have that coach or that club owner or whatever be part of it anymore. Or you're not a member of USA Biathlon?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, if the ban isn't followed, then the membership is lost. The insurance and other benefits that come along with being a member go away as well.
But it's a big country. How do you prevent that person from then turning around and moving 500 or 5,000, 2,000 miles away and, working with another club?
No, that's it. And that's where this requirement for the background checks really needs to include the center's database.
And make sure that they're always doing it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about athlete voice, Han. We hear a lot about athletes wanting to have more of a role in governance of the USOC, of the Olympic movement. Athletes are very different. It's all over the board, as you very well know, trying to organize all this. What specifically do you hear that athletes want if they were to achieve more power?
So I think it's very, very different, as you said, depending on the athlete and where they come from, their sport, the place in their career. One of the things that we've been talking about is this focus on the whole athlete, this focus on from the grassroots level, from your junior years all the way up to the point where you are an athlete, regardless of what level you're at, whether you're world championship level or Olympic gold medalist, and then how you transition beyond that. So when athletes are talking about mental health and career development and understanding where you want to go in life, having that balance on and off the field of play, all of these are really, really important, I think, and more important to athletes now who are saying, I feel like I'm on this conveyor belt and I feel like I'm being left behind by the movement. So obviously that's very important, but then there are also, for example, our Paralympic athletes who feel like they don't necessarily understand, what is our strategy for growing Paralympic sport in the country? What does our grassroots development look like? How do we get more involvement for the number of Americans with disabilities that we have? How do we get them into sport? So for different athletes, it's very, very different, but right now, what ties it all together for us is that sport decisions are being made more and more quickly because the landscape is evolving. All of our organizations are getting very professionalized, corporatized, and those decisions need to be made at a very fast pace. It's not like the 70s where you sort of had a committee and things were being decided there. And so the athletes want to make sure that when those decisions are being made, that we do have a seat at the table. And that's a very common theme that you're hearing internationally, not just in the US.
So how do you think about trying to structure that for it to include athlete voice? I mean, is there a union? Do you have a professional executive director? What are the leverages that you can What are the points of emphasis you can have that can leverage the USOC or the NGBs to improve rights or compensation or what have you?
So one of the things that we've talked about is how to organize athlete voice better. So when you have 50 plus NGBs, 50 plus organizations, all those athletes need different things. They're not always going to agree, but how do we go and proactively reach out to those athletes and organize that voice? And so in that sort of area, we do need to become a little bit more professionalized in terms of our advocacy, and also to be able to be a part of all those discussions that are happening every day. And with a volunteer organization, you just can't do that. But at the same time, when people think of a broad-based union, I don't necessarily think we're going that direction, because the athletes in different sports are so different and they have different needs. So it's more of a support mechanism, I think, that we're moving towards, to be able to have relationships with those individual groups and organizations within each sport that are doing that work. For example, professional sports unions, or women's ice hockey just formed their own. So there are those relationships that we do need to form, but I think we are moving towards a more professionalized voice that can partner with all of these other stakeholders, whether that's the Olympic Committee or the NGBs or the US Anti-Doping Agency or Safe Sport, in order to do the work that needs to be done.
Cindy, you talk to a lot of athletes, particularly about mental health. What do you've written even a story. I mean, Michael Phelps at one point has said that he had suicidal thoughts, in his heyday in the Olympics. And Michael Phelps has estimated that 90% of Olympians have like a post-Olympics depression once you're done. How do you help Olympic athletes make that transition? What do you hear that would help them to have a healthy life post-athletic career?
I think one thing that's helping them, from what I've ascertained, is the destigmatization of it. I think it's okay now to talk about it. You've seen NBA players talk about their struggles with mental health. You've seen football players walk away for a year and take a year off. There was one I wrote about a couple of months ago who didn't really detail what was going on, but he said, I took 6-8 months off and worked on my mental health. I don't know that it's actually in place there to help them, and the transition is there. I think the USOC Pivot is the program I'm going to ask, or they have some programs in place, but it's not quite there yet, and that's why it's important to focus on the well-roundedness. What do you do? I mean, Michael Phelps is not going to have to worry about money, and Michael Phelps is going to have opportunities, but what about the people who have been in the Olympics who aren't Michael Phelps? Han, I'm sure you deal with, you deal with athletes, right?
Yes.
How do you deal with finding them the help that they need?
Right.
Do they reach out? Do they feel that they have an avenue? Right. They don't have a place to reach, someone to reach out to. And that was something, Michael Phelps was actually able to get help. Can you imagine, Michael Phelps, he sought help for his addictions, and now he's speaking out about it. And he's a strong advocate for it. He could do, and I'm sure he'll be doing more.
And Han, the health benefits, if you're an athlete at the end of your career, you don't make the team, it disappears, right? And that could be the time you may need it for mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with Sarah and the Olympic Committee in providing that feedback, because I think in the past, we've tied a lot of the benefits to very short-term performance. And so, for example, you might have health insurance, which in itself is a little bit flawed, I think, for athletes, in that it doesn't cover what athletes expect it to cover. For example, if you were injured doing your sport, it's not a primary source of insurance to cover those costs. And so a lot of athletes find it to be just another piece that they have to go and seek to understand. It really complicates their lives. But yeah, like if you miss a team because of injury, or you just didn't perform, or you're having mental health issues, that's the time that you would lose that coverage. And that's the exact same time that you might need the mental health resources that are tied to that coverage. And now you find yourself on your own, going out looking in the marketplace for other sources of insurance and other sorts of help. And so that's a huge problem for a lot of athletes who might not understand a lot of this stuff, who might not have an agent. 90% of our athletes don't have representation to help them with this type of very difficult things to navigate for an athlete. So these are the types of things that we're really trying to provide feedback to Sarah about, in that I think, as she said, it's a time of crisis, so people are more open to change. And can we restructure some of these benefits and services to athletes in order to better accommodate these issues?
Listen, let's open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll get a mic over to you real quick.
Hi, my name is Miguel Blancarte Jr. I'm from Chicago. And my question centers on disenfranchisement of students in sports. Shannon, you mentioned earlier that you feared that kids were losing out on sports altogether because of certain factors. Now, my question is, how do we build equity within the children themselves to be more inclusive regardless of their health and weight and other factors? I asked this because I, as a child, was very disenfranchised with sports in general because I was a very heavy kid. And up until a couple years ago, I was really heavy and I lost the weight on my own, healthy eating and exercise. But as a kid, being the heaviest in the room, being the last one to be picked up for in a sport to play, honestly, I thought the only sport that I could do was swimming because it was not only something that I was buoyant in, but also because it was solitary, right? And so I was doing it on my own. And fortunately now I'm a runner. I actually run for Team USA, Team USA Endurance. My story came out a little bit about losing the weight and picking up with running. And now I'm fortunate enough to run with Olympians. But my question is, how do we bring that to kids themselves? Yes, it's great to, help children be more safe in that perspective of making sure that, instructors and coaches are not doing what they shouldn't be doing. But also, how do we, within kids themselves, how do we make them unite a little bit more?
Shannon, you have thoughts on that?
Well, it's certainly a more broad issue than we can probably handle in the next minute or so. But I think it does go back to the idea that athletes should be those who want to play, and so we need to make sure that that opportunity is available. And maybe there are things that we can do to help change that culture of how we think about athletes and what the focus truly is. I mean, you go back again. I know it's a lot of times we're talking about youth sports, but we are talking today about the Olympic movement, and it does go back to that idea of Olympism, and it's not about winning. It is about the struggle. And I think that's really important to remember, that sport is not about standing on the podium or getting that medal. Sport is about the process. It's about learning. It's about the incredible life lessons, the goal setting, perseverance, the leadership, teamwork, all of these incredible benefits of sport, as well as the physical activity. And as a big advocate for awareness of childhood obesity, I just think anytime we can get kids active at whatever level and whatever age, we should strive to do that.
Time for one more question. Yeah, Robert here.
Hi, my name's Rob Smith, and my question is focused on the athletes. We talk about you have a platform, you have a voice. We have Olympics every 2 years, and every gets decided, and then it sort of disappears. And I'm wondering, as former athletes, what your thoughts are, the willingness that after an Olympics, more involvement in the community, doing the grassroots, of like the whole team, and maybe those who didn't make the team, having a structure to go back into their areas. And some do. Michael Phelps is very active in Baltimore and so forth. But a real structure of getting the athletes into the communities after, for a year after, or 2 years after. Because you have great stories. And all the good things you're talking about, why being an athlete at whatever level is important, should be gotten now.
You want to try that?
Yeah, sure. So I think some of our athletes do really make an attempt to do that, but they're fairly isolated. So for example, we have nonprofits and that do work like getting athletes into schools to talk to kids. There are some programs like that, but for the most part, one of the things that really inhibits that is athletes' ability to earn income. So if you're an athlete, for example, our curling team that was much celebrated for good reason, all the adversity they went through to win a gold medal in Pyeongchang. They're working day jobs, they've got families, and then they got to train and compete on the side. When you have that level of time commitment in your life, it's very difficult to go out and be accessible to the community the way that some of the professional athletes can be. So one of the things we're working on is how do we give athletes a little bit more opportunity to earn a regular income. We're not asking to be wealthier like professional athletes in many cases, but I think that would allow athletes to be a little bit more engaged on a more consistent basis.
Sarah talked about sponsors are looking for opportunities. What a great way of a year after athletes are coming to town. I mean, like, to me, that would be a very,
Oh,
and it'd be a
absolutely.
way to introduce what Project Play talks about, is playing different sports. You know, not just have one athlete, but have several different ones, and to get that kind of community activity going.
Absolutely agree.
That's a good thought. Well, listen, we could keep taking questions here for a while. Some of them will stay around here as well afterwards. You can come up to them and talk. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here. Please give them a round of applause. And real quick, so just wrapping up our event, thank you again to Sarah Hirshland and the USOC for the thoughtful conversation at the start of the day. If you registered to attend in person or online, to watch online, you will be receiving an email soon with a post-event survey. Please take the survey. It will really help us to improve our events in the future. And also, we want to get your comments and your opinions about the specific topics as well. Again, thank you to the Washington Post, which is now a Future of Sports media partner for us. Our next Future of Sports event will be announced at a date later this year, so be on the lookout for that information. Big thank you to our Aspen team, Tom, Jennifer, Marty, Emily, Fumi. They take a lot of time out of their work to help put this on, so greatly appreciate it. The event can be watched again on replay at our website at as.pn/Olympics. You can continue to join the conversation on Twitter by following us at @AspenInSports. Last thing, for those who don't know, our 2019 Project Play Summit is going on the road for the first time. Usually it's been in Washington, D.C. We're going to Detroit on September 17th and 18th. And public registration opens next Tuesday, May 28th. So if you're interested in attending, be on the lookout for that information. And lunch is now served in the lobby, and thank you all very much for being here.